had just earlier adopted a inclusionary housing fee, which is a fee that is paid by developers of housing to go into a trust fund for affordable housing. And we had also adopted a linkage fee, which is a fee that's imposed on non-residential developers, recognizing that the employees that work in their establishments are going to need housing, and there's a kind of a fair share of providing resources for that. And the city's housing trust fund was really all in some forward planning we were doing, because we knew at some point in time redevelopment would end, the money flowing into our low and moderate income housing fund would cease, and affordable housing is very important to the city, and we wanted to have resources to do that. So that's why we set up the trust fund, and that's why we adopted the linkage fee and the inclusionary fee. That's why we applied for the state grant. Shortly after receiving the state grant and adopting the linkage fee and the inclusionary fee, the housing market completely fell apart, and the city council set those fee levels to 0, and they review that on an annual basis. I think they've been at the 0 level for about 2 or 3 years now. There's another review coming up in the future. But because we did not have that ongoing revenue in order to qualify for the grant, the redevelopment agency, using its own tax increment funds, general tax increment money, not housing fund money, did agree to provide, and the board voted to provide $150,000 a year for 5 years. And I think we've had one payment, and the second payment's this year, and then we have 3 more to go. So to us, that was an obligation that the redevelopment agency made to the city to provide the financing for, or the matching share of that grant, and that's why we feel it's an obligation that belongs on the ROPS. It's an obligation of the redevelopment agency.
Thank you, Mr. Mitnick and Mr. Prescott. So do we have questions for staff? Mr. Jersey?
I'll start with the easy one, I guess, and that is on the housing trust fund. Do we have is there a contract with the state in that regard?
There's a grant agreement, and it's with the city. So the city
has the grant agreement. Oh, okay, that's,
yeah.
That's
the city
why
applied.
The state says it's not.
Yeah, the city applied for the grant, and then the matching funds, however, are provided by the redevelopment agency.
Excuse me, John, and then to verify, so then there was an agreement between the redevelopment agency and the city to provide the matching grant funds for the period of the 5-year grant of the city.
Yes, it was calendared as an agenda item before the combination city council and redevelopment agency board, but they took the action as the redevelopment agency board and obligated redevelopment money.
Mr. Watkins, Mr. Bowman?
Well, on the housing trust, what was the date of that agreement?
I don't recall offhand, Russ, do you remember?
Roughly?
It's going to be
Is it in
early
America?
2011, I want to say.
2011 sometime?
Yeah, I believe so. Early 2011. Can I add one point of clarification? The matching funds are on
Go to Mike.
I'm sorry. The matching funds are actually on deposit right now, and one of the conditions of applying for the grant was to demonstrate an ongoing revenue stream that would allow us to actually qualify. So there were twofold components. We had to have the matching monies already to qualify for the grant we were requesting, and then we had to demonstrate an ongoing revenue stream. So this $150,000 is the second component of that.
But that agreement is between the city and the RDA to provide the $150,000 a year.
That is correct. And then we have an application with the state that qualified us for the NOFA, and then we have an agreement with the state for those matching funds.
Yeah, okay.
And that agreement between the RDA and the city took place prior to the prohibition against additional agreements in the whole RDA state legislation.
Let me make
Yes.
clarification. Yeah, let me make clarification. As far as the supporting documentation, That action was approved by the council July 20th, 2010, so well before the discussion of any dissolution of the redevelopment agency. So 2010, that was part of the handout or on the CD is the first page.
So if the ongoing funding was not provided from the redevelopment agency, would the city then have to absorb that difference at $150,000, or would the grant be revoked, or would you have to give money back to the state? Or?
Bill, do you want to answer?
I know some of it's in trust, but clearly
Yeah, it's a
not all of
matching
it.
grant, we haven't drawn the money down, and we won't be able to until.
We would no longer qualify under the terms of the award. And by the way, my name's Bill Hatcher. I'm a senior planner with the former redevelopment agency. As pointed out, I didn't introduce myself.
And to clarify, we would walk away from it and the housing work would not be done.
On this issue, one more question. As part of the grant, did you ever revise the grant? Any sort of form to acknowledge the fact that the money was going to be paid by the redevelopment agency versus the city?
The contributions by the redevelopment agency were a requirement for us to be able to apply for the grant. So it was after our housing program funds had been held in abeyance because of the severe recession. And so we talked with the state agency that was issuing the notice of funding availability, and we said, would we be able to use non-housing RDA funds if we pledged this for a period of years as our ongoing revenue stream? And they told us that would be acceptable, and so our application, the action taken by the council was actually prior to our, or a prerequisite to our submitting to the state.
Yeah,
Mr.
that's
Dorsey,
the only question I had on that one. I have a number of questions on the other project areas, and that is regard to the overall debt issuance and how much is left in, for example, you said that on the one I made some notes, and you said of the $6 million that's issued, you have $3 million of debt, or $3.8 million that you expect to. The intent was the Kelly Road improvements of $3.8 million out of the bond proceeds, and then the other, I can't read, $8.9 million out of money you have set aside in the RDA from tax increment from prior years. Is that?
That was from the 2005 refunding for the Thousand Oaks Boulevard one, and you're correct. Those dollar amounts are correct.
Okay, are they both in with the trustee right now? All that money with the trustee, or is some of it the bond trustee?
John asked that.
For correction, that's in the Newberry Road bond issue.
The 3.8.
3.8 is with the trustee currently. The $8 million would be for the complete the additional needed for the complete project. Most of that is cash on hand with in the bank.
In the bank with the RDA. And is that the same with the other, with the Thousand Oaks?
Yes. The way that you're reading that, Paul, is going back to the comments by the DOF, and specifically when we went up to the DOF on the EOPS, it was all combined, and they did not have forms. So when they came back and talked both about Kelly Road and Teal Boulevard undergrounding, those projects exceeded the original bond proceeds. So with the revised forms and the direction given by the DOF, and our position now is that we've identified what is bond proceeds and what is, in theory, would be money from reserves or other possible sources in order to complete those projects per the original bond indentures.
The question I have is, it seems to me at least we're doubling up somewhat on our indebtedness, and the fact that it's already in the bond that we're paying debt on, and then we're adding it again as part of the ROPS because there's no contract that's been signed relative, and I guess that's where I'm having an issue from my standpoint, is that we just don't, I haven't seen, and there's no contract going forward, and I'm looking at our dictate, so to speak, is to wind down the affairs, and I'm not sure how expanding or contracting with, to do something maybe a year from now or 6 months from now or whenever it would be, is winding down the affairs, and while we continue to pay off, you know, down the road for another 20 years. We'll have the debt, obviously, but as far as projects going forward, I'm uncomfortable with approving projects going forward that clearly the state has already rejected from their ROP on the EOPS standpoint. So.
And for clarification, that was because, and I'll get back to the 6 items that they provided us a letter in response to the EOPS. And those were the 6 items. We had talked to them specifically about the projects that we're talking to you now. We did break up Kelly Road and Teal Boulevard to separate out what is bond proceeds, which have their own, you can say, obligation, and then the rest of the project as far as reserves. If you want to look at the legislation, I think one of the questions as far as bond proceeds, and I can reference a section if you want to take a look at it, it's 34177, and it's I, and it talks about using bond proceeds to fulfill the original obligation or intent of using those bond proceeds. And so from our perspective, using those proceeds as the original intent of the bond proceeds is why it's on the ROPS. And I know what you're saying about you have these bonds that have to be paid, and that is paying from an obligation from the trust fund from future tax increment. But we have funds now with the trustee that are reserved and specifically identified for specific projects. And so to treat that, that's why it's on a separate form, and that's why we're identifying as projects being used from either bond proceeds or reserves. So I know where your conflict is, and I understand it.
I think that's what I'm having an issue with. I think from the overall standpoint, it would seem like it'd be more appropriate that the debt is on the schedule, obviously, that however, let's just make it easy, and I'll talk about the $6 million on the Newberry Park Road one. The debt is there, and we're gonna be paying out of the increment the debt for however many years we have left on that. And included in that debt is $3 million theoretically for contracts that have not been let. Wouldn't it be more appropriate if the contracts haven't been let, that to come back to this council or to this board to approve those contracts rather than approve them on the ROPS? If this board deems that it's in the best interest of the taxing entities to proceed with those projects, then they could approve those projects.
I think I understand where you're trying to go. Is the fact is we have taken the conservative approach of showing everything, whether, and I'll talk about the bonds, whether we have a contract, a true contract for the undergrounding. We focus more on the undergrounding just from a perspective. We have a bond issue. Those call dates are several years out. Actually, I think 2015. The original intent was to do underground as one of the items. We don't have a true contract, but we have an obligation of bondholders to spend the money as it was originally intended. We took the approach of listing that on the ROPS as as proceeds or revenues that we had that ultimately that are obligated to be spent on that purpose. I know what you're saying. We should have just maybe left it off and came back when we had with a contract to do the undergrounding, and then showed as an obligation to use those bond proceeds. I think that's where you're going. But we took the approach of adding them now and not coming back to you later to spend the bond proceeds.
Yeah, I guess the way I'm looking at it is that we've already got the bonded indebtedness for that project. Clearly, it's not enough to complete it, or you can only do, instead of being able to do 2 miles, you can do half a mile with the bond proceeds.
Correct.
It seems like that would be appropriate to come back. I just can't see how spending it, I'm looking at from the overall taxing entity standpoint, how spending $8 million of cash for undergrounding, or maybe I'm looking at the wrong one, I'm getting them, but regardless, any additional dollars that's in cash, spending that on a specific project, how that's in the best interest of all the taxing entities, and especially when I think the state is looking at it from that perspective also, and has already looked at it and denied deny that additional.
Right, and talking about the DOF denying, I think their main issue was that the amount of the project was in excess of the bond proceeds.
That's right.
Going back to Scott's comments, and what they actually said was bond proceeds are protected. That was their interpretation when we were there. That's what they said. I mean, they said multiple times, protected. I think if you look at that section of the code, it says you use the bonds for the original purpose of what the intent was. The intent was to do the undergrounding. We have it as an obligation going forward. That's why we've listed it.
If I could clarify on page 22 what the table is, items 12A and 12B, that's the undergrounding of the utilities. This will provide clarity. When the EOPS was done, it showed the total project as a sum of those, so 10.4 plus 3.5, so
3.8 or 13.8.
13.8, and then when we met with the auditors, they said you can't have it as 13.8 because you're combining bond proceeds and tax increment reserves. We need to segregate the two, and that's what we did. And they said if you do that, you're protected. I remember that, you're good if you do that. And we did that, but then a letter came the next week saying no, but it was saying no because it was all combined together. So it should be on the list. The bonds were issued in 25, and they're delineated, so that's where we're coming from.
I just need a better definition of terms.
Okay.
So when I'm looking at the table and I'm looking on page 22, item 12A for the
Right.
undergrounding,
Right.
where there's 10,420,000 and change for bonds, that is money that's all, bonds that have already been sold.
Money's in the bank.
Money comes to the former RDA, it's sitting in the bank.
Yeah.
Reserves speaks to money that would come out of future increment?
No, money we already have in another bank account from tax increment.
Okay, so money that came out of increment, that's just been received through the county?
Yeah, we've had it in the bank,
Process.
in our savings account.
Yeah, let me just spend a minute going through the forms, because I think it's very important. If we're looking at form, let me just throw out, I think, page 52. We're at page 52. It says, if you look at funding source, it says,
There is no page at the top. Oh, we'll leave late on another agenda item?
yeah, I'm sorry, I'm looking at it. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
22, let me get to the right page. I was looking at the next one. 21. 21 is what is gonna be paid in the future from tax increment, from future tax increment, from the retirement trust fund. So that is what's coming from future tax increment. And if you look at about halfway in the middle of the page, it says funding source. Our PTTF is the trust fund, the retirement trust fund. And if you look at page 22, those are all the projects that are identified to be paid from current cash on hand. When I mean cash on hand is either with the trustee or money in the bank that is not with the trustee. Stuff that's in the trustee or escrow would be Auto Mall, T.O. Boulevard, a portion of it. So, you know, getting to Paul being, Mr. Dorsey delineating that the first page, page 21, is based on future tax increment or current tax increment, where 22 is based on current reserves. Okay?
That was some of that, excuse me. I had other additional questions regarding the call dates and those types of things. We don't have that kind of information relative to the debt. Right now, the call that you said was 2015?
Well, each bond issue is different. We did get a request from another oversight board member yesterday morning. I have staff working on we have probably a dozen questions from various board members that staff is working on, specifically on the 2005 series. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's Series B. It's 2015, which is, I think, the taxable portion. But that's just off the top of my head. So those do have call dates that are several years out.
I know it might be a little bit time consuming, but I had a hard time going back and forth from this to looking at the pages. I would really like an opportunity to just start with the very first printout and have you just say, I mean, literally 30 seconds.
Sure.
This page is the bond repayment schedule for the housing bonds.
Okay.
This page shows specific pass-throughs, and just so that I'd like to be very, very well aware, and then as you go on each one of those pages, would you note any of the items that the state is saying they have concerns about, and what we're hanging our hat on in terms of saying that we shouldn't have concerns?
I'll be happy to do that. So I'm gonna start on, now I'm not gonna repeat this when I do the second presentation, but I'll start on page 15,
Okay.
the Exhibit A. I think that would be really, so the ROPS does have a cover form, and that is the cover for specifically the housing.
Excuse me,
I'm
mine
sorry.
doesn't have numbers for whatever reason, I don't know why.
I think the difference is, some of us probably printed out what was emailed to us from the agenda, but other people got handouts, and I think they're numbered differently.
Okay.
So let me,
Exhibit A.
Exhibit A, first page, Exhibit A.
It's for the low mod housing.
Correct. And it's actually in not landscape, but portrait. And this is just a summary form that's sort of fed by all the other forms. The first line is the outstanding debt or obligation. It shows you the total debt that is owed by that component or that project or the low and mod housing fund. And it shows you the total during the fiscal year, which is 328. And then we talk about what's due for the 6-month period. We're talking January through June. We got $2 million that's due. And it talks about what is being paid from the retirement trust fund versus what is being paid from cash. Yeah, enforceable obligations paid to administrators. Okay, so that's the summary. That's going to be similar to all of them, and they're going to be rolled up based on all the worksheets. So the second worksheet, which is what we would call Form A, it's in the right-hand corner, still covering low and mod. These are items that are going to be paid from trust fund, from future tax increment. I forget the exact name for our PTTF, but it's trust fund. I think it's retirement property tax trust fund. Yeah, there we go. And so that shows you the obligations, not just for this for 6 months, but potentially future 6 months all the way until these obligations are paid off. So the first one is the most current bond issue that's due for the housing. The second one is the state loan. That is the 1.9 million. That's an obligation to be paid, I think, in 2015. And then we have some administrative costs related to managing the bonds, disclosure, that type of stuff. And then the fifth one is the Bank of America settlement, the stall settlement. I got a question on that. There is no dollar amount out there right now. It's based on claims made. Staff's perspective on the possible claim is certainly under $100,000 or even less. And there was a memo that was part of the documentation that we provided to you, but the obligation is out there until the bonds are all paid off and we have no more claims. The exposure for the redevelopment agency is under $100,000 for all funds. Okay, so then the next sheet, which is Form B, talks about obligations specifically in the low and mod that are being paid from current revenues or reserves or bonds. There are no unspent bond proceeds in the housing fund. So the first one is Sheila Gardens. Now, with this form, and you have to step back and look, this is sort of a carry-on from the EOPS. And what I want to say is for those that may or may not know, in the law, the housing assets are moved over and separated from the successor agent or from the successor agency, and we have a successor agency housing fund. And so most of these obligations will follow with those assets. And those assets have already been moved over to the city, but we did list them as obligations. And as you can tell, let me just go through. Sheila Gardens, the agency owns an apartment complex. Those costs are related to the administration of that complex. Housing Assistance Program is our HAPS program that provides support to low-income seniors. And then some minor costs, and then personnel and citywide cost allocation. Form C, administrative allowance is blank, and then Form D, which is pass-throughs, low mod does not have pass-throughs. So those are the 4 forms, or the 5 forms. They're all the same for each of the project areas. So I'll go through quickly the other ones, and as I go through them, if you have questions, please ask.
So for the housing though, there were no questions from the DOF, right?
Correct, nothing related to the housing. Now, you have to remember, when we provided the EOPS, and that was attachment B. Attachment 2 was the EOPS. The State Department of Finance did not have developed forms. There was sample forms. And so when we provided the EOPS, it was only 3 pages. It wasn't 15 pages. And so, yes, there was nothing that they identified that was related to the low mod housing. So again, Thousand Oaks Boulevard project area, that's the cover form. It provides some summary information, total debt or obligations, what's going to be paid from the retirement fund, what is the pass-through amounts. Okay. So then Form A is what's being paid from the trust fund. You have the tax allocation bonds. We show you the current outstanding as of the first of the year. We show you what's due during the first, or what was due during the full year. Trustee services, administration of the bonds, property tax admin fee. This was included, if you're familiar with RDA reporting, state controllers reports, part of your statement of indebtedness does show what your property tax admin fees would be for the life of the bonds. That's where the 2.6 million, in theory, that's the number that we came up with based on the SOI. We sort of brought it over. Bank of America settlement, I talked briefly about that, and then this is where we identified legal fees. And I think one of the board members had mentioned whether that is a ROPS or an administrative cost that should be part of the allowance. At this point, we put it there, figuring that this is one of the new items that we're adding that the DOF didn't see. We'll wait for a determination on the DOF. I think on the report, based on the limited nature, $20,000, we thought we would include in the ROPS and see what comes back, and then try to figure out how to fund it if that's not the case. Form B, this really goes into all the projects and all the items, a large majority of them that are being funded either from bond proceeds or reserves. Certainly going down the middle, you see the funding source. It either says bonds or reserves. The Auto Mall project, there's an agreement with the Auto Mall. Shows you the date of that agreement. Those funds are currently in escrow. That project, I think I had an earlier question related to whether we expect to spend the money by June 2012. At this point, that's not likely. When we did do the EOPS, it was in January. It was expected that the money may be spent by then because of some re-engineering design. That is not probably possible, but we did not change it, assuming that the Department of Finance would approve the expenditure as part of it is a contract. And if it's not spent, we would at least have authorization to use the reserves to pay for that obligation when it comes up. Topaz, a lot of discussion on Topaz. Just for clarification, we have millions of dollars in pass-throughs that are made annually through the redevelopment agency. The school district's pass-through agreement is a little unique compared to all the other entities. All the other entities get their money twice a year. Regardless, they get their percentage twice a year. For the school, the way the agreement's held is that the RDA keeps those funds until projects are identified by the school and done by the school. And so those are contractually obligated and are protected for the school district to use for any project that meets the terms of the agreement. That agreement was included in your packet. Certainly feel free to look at it. I think the total between this and Newberry Road is well over $6 million. Local Housing Trust Fund, we talked about that. West Side Properties, just cost maintaining the West Side property that's right next door to the Civic Arts Plaza. Thousand Oaks Boulevard Improvement District. I'm just going, these are all pretty small. Then we get to 12A and 12B. That's the Thousand Oaks undergrounding portion is funded by bond proceeds. We broke it up to show the other portion would be paid by reserves. Go to Discovery Center, that's the $5 million. TOB assessments, RDA in theory owns some land that it would need to pay for that annual assessment. And then we have personnel costs and cost allocation. Form C.
Before you go on that, then, let's talk about the ones that the state has a concern with, and what's the basis
right.
for feeling that they should still be on this list.
Yeah, those are numbers 3, 12A, 12B, 13.
I also had some questions on number 1 as well.
Okay. 3, I think we talked about the Housing Trust Fund. I think at the time in which when we're submitting the EOPS to the Department of Finance, we've had multiple conference calls asking various questions on various projects, provided them various documents over really probably a 3-week period. We thought we had provided them enough on the trust fund information. And when we met with them, we thought they were satisfied. We got a letter back identifying those 6 items. And we thought they were satisfied with the bond proceeds, but they also came back with the letter saying we don't agree. We did send them additional information. What staff would recommend is to leave those items on for us to provide the additional information and go from that point forward. Because if they have, thinking it through, they're going to come back, look at those items again, and we're going to provide the documentation we have, and they'll either send a letter of denial or a letter in support of those items.
But this is the item that you have an agreement between the redevelopment agency and the city to provide the matching grant.
Correct. We have an agreement. We have a grant with the city and the state identifying the redevelopment agency as the funding source, and council action on July 2010 pledging those monies for that grant.
And that source of funds was included in the grant application.
Correct.
And would it be out of bounds for me to suggest that if that funding wouldn't have been available, you wouldn't have applied for the grant to begin with?
That is 100% correct.
I have to interrupt for 1 second. Ms. Burns has to leave to catch a plane.
Okay.
Well,
I can answer questions, and we can, however you guys want to do it. I think our original intent was not to go through each single item. We thought by preparing it in advance, providing the support, if there were questions, we would answer the questions, but since.
Well, I'm just saying, is there a problem with the vote if we're one short? Because she has to leave in a couple of minutes, and I don't think we have all the questions answered yet. And then my other question. Okay, and then the other question, it says the meeting end at 5 or when we're done with the agenda?
Well, the bylaws provide that it ends at 5 unless extended, which you have the discretion. So as we get close to 5, we'll bring that to your attention. And hopefully if you're there, you'll want to continue.
And I'm happy to be quiet at any time.
I'm sorry, but if I'm going to vote on something, I want to be educated on it, and reviewing it in the absence of this kind of description was not enough for me to come to an educated conclusion.
I think we should. You should make sure that all your questions are answered, so we'll just have one less person voting on it.
And we're okay with that as far as quorum in our bylaws, right? Okay, good.
So please go ahead with your questions, Dr. Barstead.
I think I was answering a couple. Dr. Barstead wanted to clarify the items that the DOF had concerns with. Mr. Mitnick identified item 3, 12, and 13. I think we talked a lot about 12 specifically. They're concerned that the project exceeded what the bond proceeds were. That's why we separated them on the list. And then 13, they didn't, I think you saw the letter. I think their concern is that we haven't made an excess of the obligation. And I think we're going to try to do that, and that's why we're keeping it on the ROPS at this time. So with that, I will move on.
Just additional clarification on 12A. It was in the original bond statements that were provided to investors. And we're considering that to be the basis of a contractual obligation, is that correct?
Correct, and the fact that the bond, yes, that's the intent of the original bond issue, was to do those improvements, correct?
And is it the same with 12B?
No.
No.
What's the contractual basis then to 12B?
You know, we're separating them out because originally that's what the cost is for the project. So we're separating out the use of reserves versus bond proceeds, figuring that we have to use the bond proceeds for that project to add that to show the total cost. I think we were just looking at it from splitting out the 13.8 into both using bonds and using reserves.
So the entire 13 and change was part of a description to bondholders who read the official bond statement and then said, yeah, I'll invest in that bond.
Not at that time, not the price estimates, no.
Okay. But the description of the project.
Correct.
Where are you getting the cost of that?
We actually we're in preliminary design with Southern California Edison, and that was their estimate several, I guess almost a year ago.
So is there a reason why we were short 3 million? Was it just,
As far as the original bond
Yeah.
issue? Original bond issue, we have to go back to 2005. The original bond issue was a refunding. So it was refunding prior debt and allocating new money. The money at that time, I mean, the project, using those proceeds for that project, I don't think we had the cost estimates back then. And maybe Mr. Mitnick could talk a little more.
Back in 2005, we actually started this in 2004, we were envisioning a variety of projects, of which underground utilities was one. It was also streetscape, landscape, parking, and a variety of things. So we're pooling our resources to do them. The use of both bond proceeds and tax increment.
but, so you feel that under the legislation, that you can take additional reserves beyond the bonds and that's considered obligated?
I should look at my attorney on this.
That's
Well,
that's
what
your
we're-
decision.
yeah, that's what we have to say, right? That we're legally obligated
Yeah.
to spend this additional $3.5 million, and that meets the legislative intent.
Well, I think I go back to what the original project was, the fact that we are delineating what is bond proceeds and what is reserves. You know, I think we would expect the DOF to probably come back and say that portion is not, and that they would come back on the 10 and say their bond proceeds, those are okay. So I think we were trying to separate out the two.
And we were advised to do that when we were in Sacramento, to separate them.
Don't we have to spend that additional 3 million in order to make good on the 10 million that we're already obligated on the bonds? Or,
Conceptually, to do the project as it's currently designed, yes, we would. And so that, I mean, that's how we're sort of tying it together, but there is the chance that they might require another source or might say something else, we're not sure yet.
Does that answer that? Is that clear?
I have,
Go ahead, please.
well, here's what the indenture says. It says the agency currently expects that new projects may consist of undergrounding of overhead utilities, landscaping improvements, and streetscape improvements. Pedestrian improvements, including ADA, improvements, drainage projects, parking improvements, connected drainage improvements, civic arts plaza improvements, and other improvements which benefit the project area. So, the question I had was why, to me it's duplicative. If we have it on the debt, it's included already in the $50 million, why are we listing it again?
So what would you do with the bond proceeds? What would,
The bond proceeds are, what would I do with the bond proceeds?
I mean, you're
Well,
saying not to do
if-
until you obligate or contract to use those bond proceeds that were with the trustee.
Right, to me, having the state approve something on this still would not allow the former RDA to go ahead and contract with those. Those still have to be approved by this oversight board and go forward and be approved again by the state and by, well, multiple state agencies, let's say. So I'm just wondering why we would include the projects twice. I mean, they're already in the debt. I think we're overstating our debt when we say we have an additional $13 million in debt when we already have it in the 50. Well, the 13 is not 13, I guess it's only 10. In this case, it's 50 million, and 10 of that is we've already issued debt for. The other 3 is cash, but forgetting about that, the 50 million already includes the 10 million that the state says that, according to what you're saying, is that when you were up at the state, they said, okay, you need to separate it out. We wouldn't approve the cash aspect, but we would approve the, because clearly it's already, debt has been already issued for that. Why? I guess they couldn't deny the $50 million bond indenture right now. I mean, that's clear. We're gonna, regardless of whether that project goes forward, and we're still going to pay the debt on that $10 million for the next
Correct.
X number of years.
Correct.
So including it on the below seems like we're doubling up. And then on the other side is the the additional $3 million. I don't believe should be on there at all because it's not part of the debt. I mean it's not contractually obligated and it's cash that is sitting aside. I'm just trying to be pragmatic about this from a standpoint of what I feel comfortable approving.
Right, but Paul, look, I mean, I guess I don't want to get into how tax increment and redevelopment agencies issue debt they issue debt to be, to have indebtedness in order to receive tax increment, correct? So you have to issue debt in order to fund capital, correct? And let me take your thought and let me go to number 6, payment overlay, right? You see that payment overlay 614202, right? It's a project. We actually have a contract finalizing. It's being paid as most expenditures are from bond proceeds. That's listed and that's contractual. So I'm trying to figure out how. I mean, the only difference here is one has a contract with the actual, where the other one is the bond proceeds that has its own contractual obligation. I mean, they're both the same, just one has identified payer and the other one is.
And I would agree with that, and the same with the auto mall improvements. It seems like that's duplicative also but I think the difference could be whether or not you're paying it with bond proceeds or you're paying for it with some cash and some bond proceeds. And you're contractually obligated to do it. I think that's the difference. That's the way I look at the difference. One is contracted, one is not. But I don't know if it's a slight difference, but
I don't know how to provide clarification. I think you have what is being paid from future tax increment, which is the bonds, and I think that's and you have Form B, which is being paid by bonds and current reserves. You're not talking about future money, you're talking about current money that you have acquired through bond issues or from reserves. So I understand what you're saying, Paul, but it's really bonds are being paid by future tax increment and projects, specifically any one of those 17 are being paid by current resources, which are either bond proceeds or reserves, and that's why they're separated.
I see, okay. I understand the concept.
I just want to share with my fellow board members what's gonna be the basis to my vote on the particular items on the underground improvements, and that is that, and as well as the Kelly Road improvements, is that this money is gonna leave our community if we don't approve this. And I can tell you that from the perspective of a school district, without going into a lot of detail, additional property tax money is coming from what were formerly redevelopment increments and going to the school district do not result in an increase in the local school district's funding. We have something called a revenue limit, which is our maximum guaranteed funding in any one year, which is established by the state, and it's made up of local property taxes and state aid. And to the extent that we get more property taxes, we do not see an increase in our revenue limit, we see a corresponding decrease in state aid. So essentially, taking money from the redevelopment agency and sending it to the state helps the state's budget, but does not help a local school district budget. And in the case of the pass-throughs, if for some reason the pass-throughs were found not to hold up to this process, would actually result in a reduction in capital funds for school districts specifically. So again, as a board member, from my perspective, unless I see something that indicates that it is just completely an outrageous assumption with respect to a contractual obligation, I'm inclined to approve it and send it back to the state and see whether it sticks or not, because I think we're better served as a community if the money stays within the community, as long as we have a plausible legal agreement behind that decision. And that's why my question's having to do with the bond official statement. If the state is willing to accept that a bond official statement represents contractual obligation, then I think it's in the best interest of this community to try to forward that to the state and find out, indeed, will the state accept that or not. Discovery Center, the basis to that contractual obligation.
It's gonna turn over to.
We do not have a formal contract with them, but as pointed out, it was in the east side specific plan. It was delineated that the property that we showed in the aerial would be used for this purpose, and the city did appropriate, or the redevelopment agency appropriated the $5 million, as well as other commitments and agreements with Crusoe affiliated to provide the parking. Once the project was built, there would be a multi-story parking structure on the lake's property to help park it. Staff want to add anything? John or John Prescott, John Adams?
Additional.
And we do have members of the Discovery Center board here.
I still have to call speakers up once
Oh, yeah, sorry.
questions.
And I didn't know if you wanted, I may still have 8 forms I can
Oh,
go through.
okay. Yes, let's do that.
All right, so I'm at 23 is called Form C for the Thousand Oaks project area number 2 is blank. Form B though does list, as you can tell, all the pass-through payments that are earned during fiscal year 11-12. CDUSD is the first one low from identified. We have 16 current pass-throughs. Now, this is just for this ROPS. For next year's ROPS, it will not. The county will be making payments directly to the agencies based on those agreements that are in place. We do have a question into the county audit controller's office related to CDUSD pass-through because of the TOPAS agreement and the structure there. But either way, the agreement I think will allow for the school district to receive those funds in advance, put them in a trust fund if I remember the agreement correctly. Anyway, that's the listing of the 16 pass-throughs that were paid from Thousand Oaks Boulevard. Those will continue as long as the successor agency is in place.
And that's not being questioned by the state, and I assume that that's taking place all over the state, that those pass-throughs are continuing?
Correct, not at all. I think that at least from people I know at the audit controller's office, that's probably their most difficult thing is to review all of them and make sure that they're making the correct calculations for those pass-through entities. So those will continue. But instead of being a check from the Thousand Oaks Redevelopment Agency, you'll begin directly from the county audit controller. So page, the first form on Newberry Park, summary form, page 26 is to show you items that are being paid from your tax, the trust fund. First one is the 2002 tax allocation bonds, Series A and B. We have some administrative costs, those are the rebate again, property tax and then legal fees. We just have 4,000 anticipated over the next 2 months, but that probably will not occur if you don't select a legal representative. And Form B just shows you the five items listed. The only one in which that was identified that is still on there is Kelly Road. That's 3A and 3B. 3A, as you can tell, is paid from bond proceeds. That's 3.8 million. The remainder is paid for reserves. Kelly Road project is really, I'd say, call it 3 phases. And so bond proceeds are available for some of the improvements. The rest would either be, again, from reserves or from other funding sources if the DOF did not accept those.
And so the same kinds of questions and concerns with respect to the undergrounding, that some of this is already bond proceeds, and it sounds as if you've gotten some indication from the state that they're okay with that, but they may have a problem with the reserves piece.
That is a correct statement.
And what we're considering to be the contractual obligation is the information, the official bond statement of the intent for those dollars to be spent on those projects.
Correct, and just to say what the DOF, if you've seen the letter, that is what the DOF has officially communicated. Everything else, is what we have been told personally, and that's the reason why staff would recommend leaving it on to actually get them to officially make comments on the current ROPS. Because their comments was on the EOPS.
My selfish considerations, Topaz is listed separate, where we have Topaz listed on Form B and pass-throughs on Form D.
Yes,
The
correct.
difference is the Form B, CDUSD Topazes are monies already earned but not spent,
Correct.
and the rest are futures.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, Dr. Barstad. On Form B's, number 1 Topaz is money that is earned and due to the school. Pass-throughs, which is Form D, is money that's currently being earned and in theory would be paid in the future by the audit controller. You are correct. Thank you.
And then, just one question, this is kind of across the board, but a lot of these show the payments in June 2012 of the full amounts.
Yeah,
And
I
so,
think-
for example, if we were to pass this today and it got approved by the state, these payments could be made in their entirety for
Yeah.
anything that shows paid 2012?
Correct. But, yes, and let me step back. On Topaz is a good example. The school could request reimbursement for the full amount that they've earned. So yes, that could happen. The likelihood is very little, but I think when we were originally preparing the EOPS, which was 6 months ago, we assumed that those payments could be made anytime during that period of time. I will say this, I mean, I think from a philosophical perspective, what you get is you get Form A, which is really talking about what is being paid from the trust fund, future revenue that is going to be allocated to the audit control from the auditor controller's office to the successor agency. And so that is different than what we have in reserves, and that is really Form B. And that's why we sort of put June, but some of those things may not happen and would happen in future months. The fact that these are obligations, we have the obligation to make the payment, the DOF has reviewed and approved them, then we have the ability to make those payments from any time back forward going forward. Form A really establishes what the audit controller's office will give to us and pass through in tax increment to make the obligations. And so I certainly understand the concern of all of these obligations look like they're due June, and are you going to truly pay them? Chances are not, but at least we have the authority to make those payments going forward, and we have either bond proceeds or reserves to make those payments. Hopefully I clarified that enough.
Under that same scenario, is that why both the pass-through agreement for the Canal Valley and the Topaz are separate? In other words, the Topaz is kind of left over or unspent or unclaimed, waiting for a claim on a capital project, is that correct? And then the annual increment goes into that?
Yes, we like to call it sort of a trust fund, sort of.
Holding
but
account.
yeah, make it simple, it's a holding account. So, yeah, what's on Form B is that money that is past years that's in a holding account waiting for CBSD to draw down on it. The pass-throughs are just the listing of how much they would earn. So it's, from that perspective, earned, just not spent. And Form D is just the pass-through through from Newberry Park. So I think that covers.
At one point,
Yes, Mr. Mitnick.
Madam Chair and members of the board, what we didn't put in here, but we talked about earlier on Thousand Oaks Boulevard redevelopment project area. In the EOPS, we had about $1 million for Herbs Road, utilities undergrounding. That's not on the list. In response to the meeting we had with the auditors in Sacramento, we took that off the list because we don't have a contract and it's not tied to a bond issue. And then for Kelly Road, same thing with the Timber School historical designation. I believe that was about $1 million. And since there's no contract for that, that was removed. And that there's no bond issue money for that. So those are the 2 items of the 6 that we did follow their direction. They being the auditors.
So without, I guess without any further questions, we'll.
I have a couple more.
Sure.
Relative to the TO, what is your total increment for all project areas?
21 million, 20.8 at 21 million.
And as far as, maybe this would be a future meeting, and as far as ownership of properties, how much is still owned by the RDA versus that has already been transferred to the city, those type of?
Later agenda.
We'll one of the future agendas items, probably maybe the next meeting or the meeting after, we'll be talking about the assets owned, physical assets owned. But the only thing that's been transferred is the housing assets, because the city became the successor agency of those. No other assets have been transferred from the city to the redevelopment agency since January 2011. And as you are more than aware, state controllers has a form about asset transfer, and our form was blank. I mean, there was no transfers.
And as far as the Thousand Oaks, I'm assuming that the Discovery Center is your plan was to fund that with cash. Is that cash already you have in the bank?
Yes, cash on hand. Reserves. That's when council made the appropriation back in 2007, 2008, that money was set aside as part of fund balance within the redevelopment agency.
The last, at least for now, the question I had was on some of the personnel costs. On the Lomont housing, how long do we expect the Lomont housing personnel costs to be included in this?
I was going to cover that on my next presentation on the ROPS for July through December, but no personnel costs going forward after July 1st.
Final question on the Discovery Center. That's the one item where you basically are saying you don't have a contract and it wasn't involved in any bond statement. But it sounds like the city council took an action that was recorded at a meeting in the minutes to establish a line item for a reserve for those funds. Is that an accurate statement?
That's correct.
And that's something you'd like another crack at with the Department of Finance to see whether or not they're going to accept that?
Yes, staff would like another crack at it.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any more questions? All right, let's call up our speakers. Our first speaker is Mr. Nick Kidwai.
Nick Kidwai, Director, Concerned Cities of Thousand Oaks. It's very sad that you limit us to 3 minutes, and I would appreciate if some of you should ask some questions, especially those that have questions. The really disappointing aspect of this hearing is that I can understand that you don't have legal counsel, but the job of the staff is to give both sides and total complete sides of the issues, and not try to use you as rubber stamps as they are doing right now. And I do appreciate some of the questioning, but it's interesting, your resolution talks about ABX 126. And that's what you are being governed under. It's not that, like a board member said, we don't want to have money leave our community. Let's send it to the state and see if it sticks. And I like the probable legal opinion. I won't embarrass the person. But this is the will of the governor and the both the legislatures. And your resolution talks about not to continue the RDA, but to wind it down. And I have a job, I couldn't do things in time, but at 1:30, except Mr. Wooten and Ms. Ingram, I have sent some information which was not provided to you, I believe, even though they could have. And on the City Council, they do provide information even in the last half hour. Is that there is a state document about winding down the agency, and it specifically talks about, and I'll give you the example, let's say the Discovery Center, you had done the groundwork and the architect's drawings are there. It specifically says that at that point you stop the project, pay off all the bills, and shut down the project. That's what the state has said, and I'm not making this up. That's what the state has said, and some of you may not have spent the time, but this thing has been out in the real world since January, and I've been in touch with Chris Hill's office and talked to the auditors, and you can smooth talk some people. I and Trustee Dunn spent 2 hours with Mr. Adams and Mr. Mitnick asking for the details on the ROPS, and there was nothing provided. And then I was provided with the bond for the Discovery Center, because I cannot provide you the information, but Mr. Mitnick is on the record at a council meeting, and I swear under oath, he said that the Discovery Center is not a doable project because $35–40 million, we don't have the money. Plus the important thing is that the bonds do not specify it, and like I told you, the requirement under AB is that my time is up. It's I'll like another crack at it at the next subject item. Unless there's some questions, you should ask questions. I mean, that's your job. I mean, it's not just to ask questions of staff.
Thank you, Mr. Kidwai. Our next speaker is John Bradley.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman and Board. I'm John Bradley. I'm the chair of the board of the Discovery Center. Several members of our board, our founding members, are here with us. We are obviously a strong supporter of continuing to go forward with the Discovery Center project. I believe that Dr. Bonstead said it very well in terms of whether or not we have a plausible legal agreement. I recognize that the legal agreements in all forms take many forms, and in this particular case, not only do we have a city council resolution, we have action in terms of parking commitments, and most important, we have, as the city manager presented to you, we have donations that the Discovery Center received in reliance upon those city council commitments. A member of our board is also an employee of Verizon. She had to leave a few minutes ago, but Verizon is a very strong supporter of this project and has worked very diligently to be hand in hand with the city on advancing this project. So, you know, we can spend a lot of time talking about why this is a good project, but I think the technical aspects that you've been discussing for the last several minutes basically say there is a commitment and we should honor that commitment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Our last speaker on this item is Kathy Carlson.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like the board members to look at attachment 3. That's the letter from 3 weeks ago from the state of California saying that itemizing from the auditor which items didn't have contracts and are not valid. So please look at attachment 3. The last paragraph on page 1. Finance recognizes that our time frame to review the EOPS has lapsed. However, should these items be on the recognized obligation payment schedule, ROPS, adopted by your oversight board, it's talking to you, if you put it on your list, if you adopt them, we will return the ROPS for your reconsideration. This action will cause the ROPS to be ineffective until finance approval. Black and white. When in doubt, don't. This is the second auditor. This trumps the first auditor's decision. The law says that you're not to consider intent, or if it's a wonderful idea, and if it's for the children, that old argument. Your job is to see if contracts were signed. You're supposed to wind down the RDA, right? Wind it down. If the contracts weren't signed, the deadlines were missed, that's what you need to consider. So, I see that Timber School was taken off of the list. That's the 5th bullet down. Good. I'm sentimental about some things, but gosh, you just can't keep everything, can you? You need to clean things out. So when that school gets bulldozed, they're going to save the cupola and the front doors, I've been told. Great, I think that's great. Everything else can go. And also, by the way, the state architect will come and look at that school for $500, they said, and do an examination for seismic retrofitting, because the school district wants to spend $50,000, they say. I think they're going to change their mind, but that's good money after bad. And I don't want you to be spending good money after bad, throwing good money after bad either, on projects that are going to be thrown away. For example, if let's say in a family, if a child says, if a stepmother says to the kid, you know, yeah, I will, he has a temper tantrum, okay, I will give you this special bicycle, and then, or handlebars, I guess, for a special bicycle. And then the bicycle gets stolen, and the kid throws a temper tantrum and says, you still owe me the money for the handlebars, even though my bike is gone. What kind of sense does that make? So, you're being asked to spend like $4 million for storm drain stuff at Kelly Road, and if they're never going to build that rec center, then what's the point? So, thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Carlson. Do we have additional questions of staff? Mr. Willard?
Just one question about process and timing. So if the board were to take an action today, and it's submitted to the state, and the state reviews it and rejects, you know, one or more items, can you kind of run us through the time frame? Because eventually we have to have a budget, right, by July 1st to start writing checks, or maybe checks are already due. So can you kind of run us through?
What our belief is, what will actually happen, or just, I think from our perspective, I think we would provide it within 3 days. We have 10 days to review and provide comments. I'm looking at my attorney to correct me when I'm wrong.
Don't look
Prescott. And the DOF would then provide written response to the ROPS, and we would provide documentation, additional documentation to try to support those items. I think the question is what, as far as adopting, the board certifying or adopting a ROPS and then them reviewing the ROPS, there would be items like bond proceeds, bond obligations that we've made. I mean, those payments were made in May. I think that our approach has been on the items in which DOF has had concerns, we have not had any expenditures related to those items. So for obligations that have not shown concern by the DOF, we would still continue to pay those because the EOPS is sort of that guiding aspect. if the DOF comes back and identifies those items, and we would come back to you with a revised ROPS eliminating those items if that was the case. As far as time frame, 3 days, 10 days, this could potentially be, probably wouldn't be at the May 23rd meeting, but it would have to be a meeting in June. Okay.
Jackie?
Dr. Barstow?
I'm ready to move that we approve resolution number OB 2012-02 as submitted.
Right. Do we have comments on motion? Mr. Jersey?
I'd like to comment on the motion. I think that, I think I indicated my discomfort with the number of items on the ROPS, including all the items that did not have contracts that were established, that were established on the ROPS that were not contracted at the time. I'm looking at our responsibility as oversight board to make sure that the RDA, or the former RDA, winds down efficiently and effectively. And I don't see how adding projects that haven't been contracted is going to help wind down the RDA. Again, I don't think I'm looking out for the interests of all the taxing entities, which includes the state, the county, the special districts. Clearly, well, schools would be part of that, but that, in that regard, I'm not, I would be willing to adopt the ROPS minus a number of the items. I would, if, less the items that the state had already noted that they would reject next time around, that do not have contracts.
Mr. Watkins, we still need a second on
Yeah,
that.
I say maybe if we could just second it so we know we've got a motion on the floor, and then I
Okay,
would have a comment also.
all right, so you
I second.
Oh. Right. Comments?
I hear Mr. Dursey's comments and appreciate the comments that are made. I guess we've set this up to the state. They've responded back with 6 items out of good faith. 2 of those items have been removed, and it sounds like there's been subsequent discussions to support through the bond proceeds. The others and with the trust fund, there is, with the grant, an obligation there also. So I think we're on solid ground to support the ones that are there, and so I would support the motion.
Madam Chair, I seconded, because I do question some of the items that the state Department of Finance rejected. I'm not necessarily in agreement that we shouldn't then go ahead and not approve those, but I don't think that all 6 items are all at the same level of lack of obligation, for lack of a better term. And while I would, I'm comfortable with going ahead with a motion to approve the items on the ROPS that the state had no issue with, and get those out of the way. Of the 6 items, I think it's 6 that the state had an issue with, I don't think they all don't rise to the same level of no contractual obligation, and I would like to break those out separately within that 6.
Okay, so you're not actually seconding, the motion was to accept the entire list. So you're not seconding that?
No, I'm sorry that I misunderstood. It's not to accept the entire list. It is to accept the list that the, well, it's no.
Okay, all right.
Sorry.
Okay,
Misunderstood.
and Mr. Wilmer?
Yeah, I just have a few comments just to understand where I'm coming from. To me, we have a new piece of legislation that really hasn't been implemented. So everyone's scrambling to figure out, you know, how is this supposed to be implemented? How are we defining obligation? Where are the gray areas? Staff has told us that they had conversations on multiple items that they put in front of the state where the state said it is an obligation, then they said it wasn't an obligation. I think that kind of starts to help you understand that it's not so clear right now until we start to get through this what an obligation is or not. I don't think it's truly just a written contract before a certain date, and that's the only way you can obligate yourself. So with that in mind, I actually think there's different levels of gray area. I agree that some are very clear that they're obligated, and maybe others, there's a little bit more of a gray area down to a very light gray area. But in my opinion, it's worth taking another round at the state, allowing staff to meet with them, discuss this legislation, discuss how best to implement it, and ultimately see where the cards fall. And I think the state is taking a very conservative view, and ultimately I think the best results come out of that. And what you also have to understand is that there's, you know, hundreds of cities throughout the state that are dealing with the same issue, and as each one kind of goes through, they start to figure out, okay, this kind of category is an obligation, maybe this one's not. And I think that through that process, you'll start to get a little more clarification on these issues. But I'm not ready to just say, absolutely, you know, this is not an obligation on any of the ones that staff has put forward.
So you're saying at least at this point to put the entire list forward, so you're agreeing with the motion?
I agree.
All right, and I think that we've had a very good discussion, and I think legally, everything on the list can be justified. There are some areas that are not clear, but I think we should send it up to the state, and we might as well put everything in there and see how things turn out, because there hasn't been a lot of clarity. So why don't we take a vote on the motion?
You have to have a second. You still
We have a second.
She retracted it.
Mr. Watkins seconded.
But he didn't formally.
He's formally had a second.
Is that
I'll
formal?
second the motion.
Yeah, they have a second, that's no
There you
problem.
go.
All right, vote. Aye.
Aye.
I know.
Aye.
Because it was just
Can we do a
discussion.
roll call? Board Member Barstad,
Aye.
Board Member Dursey,
No.
Board Member Ingram,
No.
Board Member Watkins,
Aye.
Board Member Woomer,
Aye.
and Chair Irwin.
Aye.
Motion passed.
All right, so we have to look at now if we want to move past 5 o'clock. I assume that we have the same, we want to go somewhat through the same process that we did before, or is this going to be much quicker?
I think this will be much quicker, a lot quicker, because most of the items are the same, just a few items different, so I can certainly.
We need a motion to proceed, right?
All right, so,
Jackie, I have to be in Ojai at 6:30, so I'm gonna be real limited after about 5:10. I hate to get started and then not be able to finish.
all right, so is 5:10 acceptable to everybody?
It's fine.
Okay, that would work for me too. I have to leave also.
Should I just be available for questions? Should I do a quick?
Do it very quickly.
Okay, well, I've done 70 slides
And
in
if
7
people feel they're
minutes,
not
so-
ready to, if there's not enough information to take a vote, then we'll just have to continue.
Is this time sensitive? We have to have. Yeah, this is the second.
We have,
So this is the second ROPS, covers, I think you've seen this, covers July through December. It still has the same cover form, which is Exhibit A. First one is the housing, specifically, Form A is the same items being paid from the future trust fund, bonds, trustee services. The one additional item here is, Mr. Dursey had mentioned about housing costs going forward. We have personnel costs. This, actually, item 6 is new for the housing, which is the monitoring of the agreements that are related to the housing fund. So that item, I think the cost, the annual, or listed is approximately $76,000 annually. So that one is listed, the 1 through 9, which is on Form B, more or less the same stuff, but again, probably it should be going with the successor agency on the housing. Let me just go through 52, or Form A on Thousand Oaks Boulevard, 1 through 5, same items as the past ROPS from January through June. It's just covering a different period of time. The way that the debt for Thousand Oaks Boulevard is the large principal payment is due in November. So the amounts that are being paid from tax increment or the trust fund are substantial in the first 6 months of the fiscal year. Form B is just those same items, the same obligations. You can see things like number 1, the auto mall is 0, assuming that we have spent it, but we're showing it on the ROPS in case it is carried forward. And pretty much this mirrors the prior forms. What is new is Form C. Form C for Thousand Oaks Boulevard actually shows you the breakout of the administrative allowance. The administrative allowance is 3% of the obligations for each fiscal year. The obligations in the first portion of the fiscal year, which is July through December, is approximately $6 million, which relates to about $180,000 in admin allowance. But on the second part, which is going to be January of 2013 through June of 2013, the obligation is less than $2 million. So the way that we have broken it out here is to show you that during the year, the successor agency, the city, expects the minimum administrative allowance of $250,000, and so we broke that out over a 6-month period, equal amounts. So Form C is really just to show you the areas in which the administrative allowance would be used. We believe as a successor agency that we'll be entitled to the minimum, because going forward, the obligations that the successor agency will be paying for from future tax increment is $8 million. Earlier, Mr. Dershey asked how much tax increment is being generated for the Thousand Oaks RDA. It's about 21 million. With the dissolution and pass-throughs being paid by the county auditor, the money that we anticipate receiving from the county auditor controller from tax increment will be about $8 million. So those are the ongoing obligations outside of this first fiscal year. So going forward, about $8 million when you look at the 3 bond issues and some of the administrative costs. Yep.
So it's not based on your tax increment, it's based on what you think the debt is for that period?
Correct. I think if you,
I can look that up, it's not a big deal one way or the other. But
one of the things that we highlighted in the staff report, which is on page 3, is to talk about the administrative allowance, which talks about we actually quoted the section of the health and safety code, which says up to 3% of the property tax allocated to the obligation retirement fund money. We're interpreting that.
Well, see, that's where I would be a little more
Oh, and
a little more on your side as far as that interpretation, but that's just, because
well,
the money that's going in there is the full tax increment, is it not?
Yes, but let me, I know you're a little sneakier than I may have been, but let me clarify.
I appreciate
it.
that.
I don't mean that in a negative. I don't mean that in a negative. Let me tell you about Form A, or Exhibit A. Look at Exhibit A, Paul. You see Exhibit A, or any of these portrait ones.
Okay.
It's, the state form is calculating it for us, Paul. But I like your interpretation. Certainly, 3% of 21 million would be 700,000, which we would be happy, but this form actually is doing the calculation for you. And so going back to the staff report actually identifies the 3% of the retirement fund for the agency. Maybe I'll ask that question later. Okay. So I think I went through Thousand Oaks Boulevard. Again, the obligations are very much the same. The items that are going to be paid from reserves, we're listing them even though there might not be money. And then Form C really talks about the admin allowance. And again, we anticipate, we've already done projections for 12-13. Our obligations are about $8 million, so we will receive the minimum according with $250,000. And then I think I don't have any other highlights I would like to add. I think if you look through the 15 pages, very similar, just different periods of time, different dollar amounts because of the bond payments and whatnot.
when I look through this, I don't see any of the items that my fellow board members had concerns about having expenditures during that fiscal period. Is that correct?
That is correct, but getting back to Board Member Warmer's question about what's the likelihood of those monies being spent in June, that, you know, that is not the chances of all of those projects having any spent money in June, especially if the DOF comes back with any concerns, which we will follow up with. So really the first ROPS is to approve those items. And remember, I think there's a separation. There's a separation of what is going to be paid from future tax increments and what the audit controller needs to distribute to the successor agency to pay those obligations. The other items that are identified on Form B are really what's being paid from bond proceeds and reserves and obligations. So you don't see them, you do see them, you just don't see any dollar amounts. And then just the last thing, Exhibit B is the administrative allowance. And I talked that Form C shows you this $250,000 split in 6 months, which is $125,000. If you combine both Newberry Road and Teal Boulevard. Based on the forms that were provided by the state, the calculation is $184,000. And that sort of matches this exhibit. I wanted just to clarify clarification is that this is the exhibit of the administrative allowance budget. And so every time you guys do a ROPS, we will also bring the administrative allowance at that point to tell you how we anticipate spending it. You know, the way that we're set up financially is to show the cost over a full year. And right now, for the first 6 months, we would get $184,000 from the audit controller for administrative allowance. But then the second part of the year, we would only get about $55,000. And so what we're really showing on Form C is that $250 split over a full 12-month in equal installments. So that